All right, it won't take long. I'm just going to hand the microphone right over to you, Chancey. Go take the floor. If you're still there.
I'm here. I'm just
Great.
switching to my notes. Perfect. And then when we do Q&A, do you want to read over the Q&A?
Yeah.
If there is any? Okay,
we'll
fabulous. Hi, everybody. I'm Chancey Fleet. I am the Assistive Technology Coordinator at New York Public Library. My branch is the Andrew Haskell Braille and Talking Book Library, so we're part of NYPL, and we're also part of the Library of Congress. And I actually joined the library in 2010 as a volunteer because I realized that we had a need in our community for people with disabilities, mostly blind folks, to learn technology skills and confidence from one another. Because if you're blind and you go into an integrated space and you want to know how to do something, even something simple like use Skype or use social media, the people around you don't know how your magnification or your screen reader or your voice control work. So it creates this profound illusion of difficulty when everyone around you is so unsure of what your path is. And I noticed that fellow activists of mine in the disability community, we would be headed down to Washington, D.C. to do some legislative advocacy. And we'd have, 3 hours on the Amtrak. And we would spend so much of that time telling each other about our technology problems and solving them and swapping advice about what phone to get, what computer tools to use, what to do in an inaccessible class. And we just developed a real resilience. And so we started what was called the Computer Support Clinic at that time. It's a little dated now, as volunteers to just pair people up with confident technology users with disabilities so that anyone could come to the library and achieve their technology goal. It went really well. Our demand kind of skyrocketed, and I got hired full-time in 2014 away from my other day job. And shortly I was joined by 2 other former volunteers. And these days we do about 150 to 160 hours of free peer-supported tech coaching each month. And then in 2017, I was approached by someone who's pretty well connected in the blind community, and all they wanted was a 5-borough map. And I thought, I have no idea where a blind person gets a 5-borough map. And I started to really consider, beyond the immediate needs that we were meeting in terms of technology support, what was our community missing? And one of the things that our community was missing was access to the means of production to produce tactile graphics and 3D representations. And so I founded the Dimensions Lab in 2017, which is a place where people can come to access skill building, support, mentorship, workshops, and equipment to work on making 3D representations and tactile graphics. Some of it folks do, sighted folks are free to come into, and people from cultural institutions do, and educators and families do. But blind folks come in as well, and they either work collaboratively with sighted team members, or they work with design using code, or they remediate images that are already available on the web. And so we started that in 2017, and that's really still going strong. And through the convergence of these 2 kind of projects, access to spatial information and access to just technology education in general, it's been my privilege to work with community partners over the years, especially since around 2016, 2017, to help patrons explore introductory topics in computer science. And that really involves a lot of basic technology education and what to me are reflexive good practices for technology education supporting students who are blind or low vision, and also access to some spatial information and spatial ways of knowing that are non-visual. So I want to talk about 4 initiatives that we've done since around 2016, and just some of the things that we did to make technology education, computer science education, accessible to youth and adults who were pretty uniformly fairly novice learners. I chose to focus on novice learners. Number 1, because we're a library, we welcome everybody. We're not huge on doing prerequisites. We want to be a place where people can come and explore something they didn't think that they could do. And number 2, in a lot of ways, I'm a novice learner, so I should be working with novice learners. And one of the best things about doing these initiatives has been being able to bring my own practice along and evolve in my understanding of computer science. And our 3rd reason for working with novice learners is that we hope by providing foundational education in a dedicated space will give people the confidence to go forward and integrate themselves into other experiences, more advanced experiences, but they really have to have the fundamental confidence first. So first off, we do introductions to Arduino for youth and adults. So as you probably know, Arduino is a popular microcontroller. It and its clones are really beloved in the maker community. There are all sorts of Arduinos available for robotics and wearable devices and IoT and all sorts of things. Natively, they're pretty accessible, right? They're just small boards with pins and headers and components. But the pins and headers and components, when they come in the mail, are not labeled in Braille. They're only labeled in print. And there's a diagram usually that comes with the device, and that too is a bunch of print. So right away, one thing we need to do for all of our workshops, adult and youth, we provide a Braille and electronic reference guide to the Arduino's major components, such as the processor, the power supply, the reset, the headers, and the pins. And we put those spatially arranged in a textual table so that people can use that card as a map, as a reference to the Arduino that they're working with. In our case, usually it's the Arduino Uno, although we do have individuals now who are branching out. Working with Arduino means wiring, and typically, wiring is accessible. The tip of a wire can be used to count pins on a header. Once you know their order, not a problem. But wires are typically kept straight, by sighted people by color so that you know if you're making a positive or a negative connection. So we ask students to just tie a knot when wiring a positive connection, and that's it, that's done. That's how we stay organized. So not a huge innovative practice, just a way of knowing, a way of keeping track of things that's alternative. Arduino has lots of online documentation and videos. I'd like to shout out the Lady Ada tutorials in particular for being fairly accessible, fairly narrative and friendly, but most documentation in the maker community features visual only content. So there might be a video that has portions of action that don't have any description, screenshots and slides that are just visual and not described, and schematics that are largely inaccessible online. So for our immersions into Arduino, whether it's the 1 hour for adults, the intensive for adults, or our 4-day for youth, we provide verbal instruction, hands-on instruction, where we pass things around and talk about them and talk about how we can differentiate them and navigate them, and electronic text instruction that is free from undescribed materials for our youth and our adult workshops. So just curating the instructional materials so that there's nothing inaccessible in the mix. The Arduino IDE, the integrated development environment, is largely accessible, but if you're a Windows user, requires you to install the Java Access Bridge. This may not be necessary anymore, by the way, for NVDA users. So if you're thinking that it's not necessary anymore, it may be right in some cases. But for most of these workshops, we've had to address it because a lot of folks use JAWS, and the NVDA bundled Java Access Bridge is a newer thing. And it's a doable thing, folks, but it involves making some changes to some Java libraries and using the command line, which can be a little bit intimidating for most novice CS folks. So our workshop actually provided laptops already configured with the IDE running and tested. And students were invited to bring in their own laptops if they wanted assistance navigating the process so that they could use their own laptops before or after our sessions. In our early Arduino workshops for adults and for all of our youth workshops, we actually avoided breadboarding and wiring almost entirely by using the Grove base shield. That would be GROVE base shield, which comes with a starter kit of sensors and inputs. And that fits over the Arduino and provides plug and play access to custom components, with including power, communication, everything, without the need for breadboards or soldering. It's no harder than plugging a phone jack into the wall. And this allows students to focus on coding concepts and troubleshooting and understanding inputs and outputs, understanding serial and analog and all that jazz, not spending a lot of time focusing on wiring. We believe that blind people can and should use wiring and learn about wiring and breadboarding and soldering, more on that later. But when we have kids or adults for 3 hours, we have to think about what our top goal is. And if our top goal is to teach coding and CS concepts, we're not going to spend all that extra time on wiring. So those Grove kits come with sensors for sound, temperature, light, among other things, a relay, servo motors, buzzers, and LED lights. So students can use them to build lots of simple tools, such as a light level indicator or a sound level indicator, a game show buzzer, or a doorbell, among other things. And when we work with students, we emphasize the need to read code precisely, preferably with a Braille display. And if they can't read with a Braille display, to set their screen reader's punctuation level to all. And we really emphasize interrogating the code, making sure that statements that get opened, get closed, etc. Right away, one of the nice things about Arduino is that there's a library of pre-made sketches that are commented out and pretty easy to read. And we show students how to read and adapt those Arduino sketches in the library to be accessible before they write their own code. We start out by showing them the button buzzer test, which typically is an LED light that lights up when you press the button. And we have them alter that so that the LED output is replaced by a beeping buzzer output. And we have them edit that length in milliseconds of the output. So that's something that they can do almost right away while they're still learning to read the code before they even have to write their first full line of code. Students are encouraged to explore the library of examples that's built into Arduino, which is pretty extensive, as well as online projects beyond the library. And they're introduced to more advanced topics like the voice recognition and text-to-speech shields, just so they know what's possible. And we hope that students will begin to think of Arduino as a way to explore physical computing accessibly, but also a low-cost way to create custom-made accessibility tools for themselves. If you do a Google for the Blind Arduino project, we have a blog. It hasn't been updated in a solid 6 months, but most of the content's pretty evergreen. We teach you how to make a continuity tester. We teach you how to use the Grove base shield. We talk to you about the IDE and all that stuff, so you can check that out. Later in the evolution of our work with Arduino, we started out, Blind Arduino project was myself, Joshua Mealy, and John Schimmel from DIY Ability. And later in our work with Arduino, we worked with more community partners, Lauren Race and Claire Kearney-Volpe of NYU ITP, to ascertain the effectiveness of using tactile graphics to enhance students' ability to work with the Arduino and the breadboards. So using the tip of a wire or a stylus, it's relatively easy to traverse and count headers on the Arduino itself or on the breadboard, but lots of students find the process of wiring a circuit really novel and sometimes confusing. So Claire and Lauren developed some tactile graphics for the breadboard and components themselves and the assembly of a circuit. So students who use tactile graphics to set up a push button buzzer generally found these graphics to be somewhat helpful, but many students also needed textual description and hands-on instruction as well to complete their first circuit and interpret the diagrams. And we believe that's largely, some of it is because the design needs some iterating, but also because for many of us, we do live in image poverty. We don't experience so many ubiquitous images from an early age, so even when they become available, the task of interpreting them can be a little bit more of a tall order for us. Moving on, this spring, right before the pandemic hit, we did a blind soldering intensive. We ensured that all instructions were available in accessible formats. We had tactile schematics for the completion of a continuity tester, courtesy of Lauren Race. You can check out her work at tactileschematics.com. There's a full flight of graphics for physical computing. We had teaching assistants from NYU, students and faculty, and a lead instructor who's blind, Josh Mealy, who's an experienced blind maker. We did a few things differently in that class. Everybody first practiced with a cold soldering iron so that they could get the idea of picking the ironing up, taking it to its target location, and then placing it back safely in the soldering iron and priming it. We used forceps clamped to a circuit board to point to a solder site so that the hot iron could be used like a tiny cane to trace the forceps to the right location. We looped solder around component points at the solder site to hold it steady rather than feeding solder, so that's a more controlled non-visual approach. And we pointed out things like the smell of melting solder and the release of tension when solder melts away and the little tick when it melts away so that students could observe a complete, when a complete joint was made non-visually. Volunteers were trained to point out potential problems and answer questions, but never ever complete steps for students. Not every student completed the project. which was a continuity tester, but everybody came away from the event with confidence in basic soldering techniques and safety. So check out tactileschematics.com. That's a full flight of schematics for physical computing. We just scratched the surface with our intensive. So 2 down, 2 to go. We have done a series of 3D printing workshops with OpenCAD. So OpenCAD is an open source, fully accessible, almost fully accessible way to make 3D designs using code alone. So a student can code simple geometric shapes that are placed on a canvas that can be rotated, translated, unified, subtracted, and scaled. Objects can be also 2D objects can be extruded at any given height, including standard and braille fonts. And output goes to STL files for standard 3D printing. Our 3D printing curriculum for blind adults was written by Claire Kearney-Volpe, and instruction was supported by Lauren Race, Joshua Mealy, and Alexis Yu, among others, at the NYPL. And the curriculum introduces fundamentals of fused deposition modeling and how it creates 3D prints. Participants are then invited to consider the Cartesian plane using pipe cleaners, popsicle sticks, and other simple manipulative tools to really get a picture of the XYZ plane. Next, folks learn about the code necessary to make spheres, cylinders, cones, cubes, and polygons, how to rotate and translate those things on the Cartesian plane, and how to scale items, and how to use code to subtract one or more shapes from a parent shape. Those are the building blocks that we need to create a complex 3D design. So finally, students are able to create chess pieces, rings, or projects of their own choosing. The biggest accessibility barrier to using OpenCAD is that the real-time rendering on screen is, of course, only visual. So students have to start printing their design or work with an interpreter to detect any errors in their code, as long as that code successfully compiles it all. Recently, I have had access to a graffiti prototype tablet and have been experimenting with that to explore on-screen renderings. It's very low res, but I think it has some promise, and I'm hoping to introduce the tool to library patrons when we can safely return to the branch. In the meantime, we're going to be running an online version of our OpenCAD course in early December with the help of 3 students from the last cohort, encouraging folks to use 3D printers at home, at school, or in community centers where possible. Finally, during this pandemic, in August through October, Claire Kearney-Volpe led a web development class with our library for blind adults that met for 8 consecutive Saturday sessions. The course introduced the fundamentals of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and provided each student with the opportunity to create a personal website. To complement the CSS section of the course, Claire and I worked collaboratively to refine tactile graphics sent to each student that show a box model, the Google web page with and without alignment, the difference between serif and sans serif fonts, and variations among font families. Claire also produced a tactile color wheel that identifies contrasting colors, as well as which colors are primary versus secondary and tertiary. Students generally found these graphics helpful, although, again, in some cases, they needed extra time to interpret the graphics because they're pretty novel, and sometimes expressed that they'd also like simpler or additional graphics. Each student was paired with a teaching assistant who was available to them after class to answer questions and troubleshoot as they built their websites. And all students were able to complete the course and build a site. So I want to bring it all together here. All of these endeavors had a few things in common. We identified a content area where some reasonable amount of accessibility already exists. We weren't like, hey, let's go use Scratch, because Scratch doesn't have significant accessibility. We identified Arduino, soldering as an activity, 3D design with code, and web development as already having pretty good native accessibility. In each of these content areas, though, the average sighted person or inexperienced blind student might identify the activity as difficult or impossible to do accessibly, because the workflows and kind of the best practices for non-visual success aren't all that discoverable on the web, and not discoverable at all in integrated settings. In each content area, we identified the barriers to frictionless accessibility. So for Arduino, some basics: labeling, wire management, visual instruction, finicky IDE setup, light used as the hello world test, and we replaced those things with something more accessible. For 3D design, We used a text-only curriculum with well-described code examples. So you don't see the code example rendered on screen. You better have a good description. And we also passed out primitives showing the code at its completion state. We enhanced this with manipulatives that students can use to understand fundamental concepts like the Cartesian plane. For soldering, having a lead instructor who's blind and documentation that emphasized effective non-visual techniques for soldering, safety, making connections, and monitoring progress. Having tactile schematics and text descriptions depicting how to complete the circuit. And that was about it. Soldering, as it turns out, is pretty accessible. For web development, we had a text-only curriculum that, again, described code examples with rich, effective description. Tactile graphics to support CSS concepts. Team members available to troubleshoot screen reader issues, so team members who understood about screen readers, and plenty of opportunities for feedback. So for all 4 of these endeavors, some things kind of applied to all of them. The library is a small branch with a small budget, and I'm the technology coordinator, and I'm kind of the one that interfaces with computer science education, and I don't know everything that I hope to know in the future. So because of who I am and because of what our budget is, we have tremendous goodwill and access to community, and we have great access to space, but not a big budget and not all the expertise that we need. So having community partnerships to bring together blind and sighted experts at the library and around the library, coupled with my ability to effectively recruit lots of diverse blind and visually impaired students and assistants, has enabled us to develop some programs that aren't available in very many other places, to spark new ideas and collaborations through our diversified teams, and to bring along students who are now able to function as assistants and volunteers and pay it forward and democratize the knowledge that we have. Again, for all 4 of these endeavors, it was really important to train our volunteer TAs and assistants to help them avoid over-helping students, to understand and respect non-visual workflows and low vision workflows, and understand a little bit about disability culture. And for our students, we needed to create an environment where non-visual techniques were taught and believed in. High expectations for blind students were the norm, and students completed every step of the process without ever being told that part of a task is too visual. We hope that we prepare our youth and adult students to go into integrated computer science and STEM settings with confidence in some basic techniques, so that if they are met with uncertainty and pushback about their participation in a CS course or a CS activity, which honestly they usually will be, they can move that conversation to one about capacity, solutions, and workflows, rather than just take exclusion from CS and STEM activities for granted. That's all I've got. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chancey. What a great program. We have some questions for you, but we're gonna pause and let the interpreters switch over. So everyone can take a minute or so to stretch their legs and catch their breath after hearing all about Chancey's inspiring, amazing program there in New York.